Let's go ahead and just do a few prayers and a little bit of meditation, and then I'll talk a little bit about this two-session course that I'm doing tonight and next Wednesday. So let me start by sharing the prayers. So let's just do the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha once. It says there 3 times, but I think tonight we'll just do this one time together. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Excuse me. And let's do the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then Refuge in Bodhicitta, which we will do as we usually do, first in English, and then twice more in the Tibetan chanting. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merits I create through listening to the Dharma. May I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chunyan gipe sonam gi, dola penshir sangye drupar shok. Sangye chodang soki choknam la, Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi, daki chenyen gipe sonam gi, dola penshir sangye duparsho. All right, let's do a short meditation. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a little bit by first attending to the breath. So for the first few minutes, just use whatever technique you usually use with the breath, trying to keep the awareness there whenever the mind wanders and gently guide the mind back to the breath. Then I'll come in a few minutes and I'll lead you in a short reflection on setting our motivation for tonight's class. So the Buddha himself said that he came to teach two things: the reality of suffering and the reality of the end of suffering, the cessation of suffering. In this course, we're going to be dealing with a lot of philosophical concepts, but it's always in that context of what the Buddha taught. To understand that the reason why we are in the state that we are in is due to our own confusion, due to our not seeing things correctly. And to recognize that the Buddha taught a way out of that. This science of inner peace that we're going to be discussing tonight and next Wednesday. It's all about using the teachings that the Buddha gave us in order to accomplish our own freedom from suffering. And this is our first level of motivation that we can bring to these teachings, is to want to know peace once and for all, not just a fleeting or temporary experience of peace, but true lasting peace, the complete calming of all of what obscures our own minds, and the ability to then help others to do the same. And this is the greater level of motivation that we want to bring as well to tonight. Wanting to be able to benefit all beings through what we are learning here in these sessions. Now, our own well-being is never isolated from the well-being of others. We always hold those two thoughts together. We're here to work on ourselves so we can achieve our own peace. But that's so that we can help others to do the same. These two are always united, self-purpose and the purpose of others together in this mind of bodhicitta, this wish to develop ourselves all the way to Buddhahood, so we can then lead others to their own state of peace, to their own Buddhahood. So hold this motivation of bodhicitta very deeply in your heart, so that what we do becomes a cause for not just our own welfare, but the welfare of all sentient beings without exception. You can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. So again, it's really good to see all of you online, as well as the folks here in the Gompa. And let me talk a little bit about this course. I think the title I actually got from Lama Yeshe House. I noticed that Jackie is here, who I think she attended these teachings that I gave some years ago at Lama Yeshe House up in Denver. And they gave this title to a sort of kind of a weekend course where we looked at these what are called the tenet systems, philosophical tenets. We're going to talk about that a little bit tonight. I'll introduce you to that. This is by no means going to be like the full tenet course, though, that the FPMT does have in the basic program, a rather lengthy course. I think when I teach it, it usually takes me something like, I don't know, 25, 30 sessions, something like that. So I'm going to be cramming everything in its essence, the main points, into these 2 nights. And of course, the points that are most salient for our practice, the things that we can really take away from this and begin to investigate. What are the causes of our own inner peace? Through being able to see the wisdom that the Buddha gave and to come to know it for ourselves. So that's the main impetus for this course, is to be able to kind of do an overview of this topic of tenets. So again, the word tenet, it's kind of an interesting word. I never ran across it until I came to Buddhism. By the way, one thing I might mention before we get too far into this, this is a subject that, even though it does seem to be really kind of philosophically oriented and perhaps a little more advanced, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I attended some teachings that he gave in Paris in 2004 or 2003. It was 2003. And he said when he was like there for a week, which was amazing to have a week with His Holiness in Paris of all places too. But he said he wanted to do the first 2 days as kind of introductory for those who were new to Buddhism. And then the last 5 days he would get into the text that he was going to explain, which was a text by Nagarjuna and what have you. But what was interesting, in the first 2 days, he talked about these tenet systems as like beginners teaching. So don't get intimidated by a lot of the language that we're going to be using. We're going to be using some Sanskrit words and what have you for different philosophical systems. Just know that I'm going to try to boil it down to its essence and really keep it, again, something that we can approach and come to know and understand because it's a tool for us to use, again, to pacify our own states of mind that are built on misconceptions. This is one of the big messages that the Buddha gave, essentially, when he was, as I said, in the motivation, he came to teach suffering and the end of suffering. Well, how does suffering end? Through removing our misconceptions and removing everything that is generated on the basis of our misconceptions. So again, I'm going to be talking about this topic from that point of view of how do we use these teachings in the most skillful way. Might mention that I have given some materials, or actually I didn't give the materials in this case, I actually put them on my own Google Drive for this course. You can find them in the materials link that's on the TNL's website for this course. And I just want to introduce tenets really briefly. I've got like many pages of extracts that I've taken from various texts that I'm going to be referring to, but I won't be going through these like page by page, saying everything, and going through kind of in great detail using all of this. Rather, these are things that you can read afterwards. But as you see in that quote from Jeffrey Hopkins, tenet is a translation of the word siddhanta or siddhayanta. In Tibetan, it's called drupta. And that literally means established conclusion, that which is an establishment and a conclusion. An established conclusion is so called because a meaning has been established for the holder's mind through reasoning, scriptural citation, or both. And that person will not pass beyond this conclusion. So what's interesting about tenets is tenets are set up in a sense as a way of looking back on what the Buddha taught. Because the Buddha didn't teach the same thing every time. In terms of the level of the people that were there attending his teachings, what was needed at the time, he essentially gave teachings that were different throughout his teaching career. He taught for, 45 years. And so when we, in the Tibetan tradition, what they have done is they kind of look back on everything that the Buddha taught and assembled this study of what we call these philosophical tenets. It's not to say that these points of view weren't held by Buddhist practitioners, they were. But for those who kind of took the first step into Buddhism, they had a way of looking at things that we're going to be going through. And then there was a second step, a third step, a fourth step. And even within those, there were different iterations of views that were propounded. And this is all based, of course, on the Buddha himself and the teachings that he gave, because those were very different. There were different philosophical systems. But a tenet is something that someone holds on the basis of their own reasoning and investigation. And so everything that we're looking at is a point of view, a view that is being held that is set up for a particular person. I know some people from other traditions, looking at Buddhism, they might think, well, this doesn't make the Buddha a good teacher, that he didn't teach the same thing every time. He should have taught the final view, and that should be all that he needed to teach. But the Buddha has skillful means. And skillful means that he will teach exactly in accord with who is present and exactly what they need. I don't have such skillful means, so I can't tell what people individually need, but I'm going to give you a survey of these different points of view so that you can come to appreciate the way in which the Buddha taught us to move in this direction, to eventually get to the subtlest and most profound view that the Buddha taught. Now, most of you who have gathered here, if you haven't studied tenets before, you may not have heard a lot of these other points of view. You probably have learned the final view, the view of emptiness, as we call it in the middle way school. This point of view that is said to be the final view of all that the Buddha taught. And this, of course, is what we do need to generate in order to attain liberation, in order to attain enlightenment. But to get to that view, it's kind of a shame. Most of us come in and we learn that final view right from the beginning, but we don't go through the gradual process, kind of looking at the coarser tenet systems and seeing what the Buddha taught there, coming to appreciate that the Buddha was trying to guide people very skillfully to this very, very profound truth of emptiness. So this is, again, a good, even if we haven't had those teachings before we arrived at the final destination, the final point of view, it's good to have some exposure to this, to know that the Buddha didn't just teach this one point of view, this one way of expounding upon emptiness. So I am going to give you before we go back to the handout, I want to give you just a little bit of some words from, this is actually a book that I found that is kind of interesting. I don't recommend it necessarily because it's from a different Tibetan school in terms of their way of looking at this. But it's a quote from Khenpo Tsotrem that Andy Carr did in his book. He says, in Buddhism, you are encouraged to use your own intelligence to analyze whatever is happening. You analyze yourself for the various views. Not only are you allowed, but you are encouraged to do this. The metaphor that is used to illustrate this is the purchase of gold. Many of you have heard this before. The Buddha himself uses in a sutra where he said, you should treat my teachings like gold. And if you are a merchant of gold, well, then you want to analyze the gold before you buy it to make sure that it actually is gold. Before you bought it, you would examine it well before you paid out so much money. I just saw something about how gold bars are worth like $1 million now or something. It's outrageous how much a gold bar is worth. But if you're going to spend money in buying gold, you want to make sure you get what you're paying for, right? In the same way, he says, you use your prajna, your wisdom, to analyze and to examine the situation well. There are many different stages of analysis within the different vehicles and also within the different views. This is the point. He's not teaching the same thing all the time, the final point of view, but rather different views that we can analyze and come to appreciate. He says, what is this self? What are phenomena? Or what is reality? These are the questions that scholars and the realized masters of the past asked themselves over and over again. They found answers to those questions, which were then included within the treatises. There is probably no rock that they did not overturn, no questioning that they did not pursue. We have we're standing on the shoulders of all these great masters of the past, Nagarjuna and Sangha and many individuals who investigated what the Buddha taught. I think this is one of the most amazing things is that we're living in a time where although, yes, things are difficult in terms of practice, but we have so much that we have access to now. The time of the Buddha, of course, this is what people were doing in India, was investigating the nature of things, investigating the self, investigating reality. And here we are now. There's not as much of that, perhaps, and maybe science has taken over some of that to some degree, and it's not as much of a philosophical issue. But we now have access to so many teachings that can help us on our path. So this is our job as Buddhists, is to analyze, to look at things, to really come to know if what the Buddha taught is true or not. And if it's true, well, then, yeah, we can, just like buying the gold ore, well, we can, subscribe to the Buddhist teachings and come to investigate them even more deeply and gain the benefit from following them. So this is what we're going to be looking at again in these 2 nights, is to really, what are the teachings that we need to analyze and come to know? So again, tonight I'm going to introduce you to this study of philosophical tenets. I sort of began that already by just even introducing you to the word tenet. Then we're going to, hopefully we'll have time for all of this tonight, begin to explore self and reality in what are called the Hinayana tenet systems. And there are 2 of those, the Vaibhashika, the Great Exposition System, and the Sautrantika, the Sutra system. So those will become more familiar to you as we go through this. Let's go to, again, I've got 3 different handouts in terms of the texts that I've taken extracts from. The one that I just began is handout number 1, and it's an introduction to tenets. I'm just going to go through some of the main points on that. I won't, again, go through every single paragraph or else we won't finish at all for sure what I'm trying to cover. The second one is on the Hinayana schools, and I hopefully will get through, again, the main points on that tonight as well. And then the third one is on the Mahayana schools. You're welcome to read these outside of class to get an appreciation for, enlarging on what I'm going to be able to share tonight. And certainly you're welcome to read the third one in advance of next week if you'd like to, just to get a flavor of what we're going to be talking about. But there's definitely this idea that these tenet systems are like rungs on a ladder, I think is the word that Guy Newland uses in his book, Appearance and Reality. This, by the way, is a wonderful book, very thin one that covers all of what I'm going to be talking about in much, much more detail. So you have kind of some extracts from this book and a few other sources that will be in the handouts. If you want to go whole hog on this, you can certainly go to this, but then there are even bigger books on tenet systems. I think Jeffrey Hopkins published one that's over 1,000 pages called Maps of the Profound. I didn't bring it with me. But this is a huge topic in Buddhist philosophical studies in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Again, it's so that we can understand everything that the Buddha taught and gain an appreciation for how this is intended to help us to move along on these rungs of a ladder, to approach this highest view. Even if, again, we were introduced to the highest view right from the beginning, we can gain some appreciation for the other points of view that are taught. So, whoops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put that back up. Let me go back to my share screen and put up the handout that I was just working with. So I'm not going to read what Daniel Coatsart says about tenets. All of the tenet systems are essentially identifying with what are called the four seals of Buddhism. I'm going to review these very briefly. Hopefully, most of you have heard these before. These are the underpinning for what makes someone a Buddhist philosophically. You can be a Buddhist by taking refuge and practicing according to what the Buddha taught, but this is philosophically what's involved. So, as Jeffrey Hopkins says in introducing us, he says a Buddhist proponent of tenets is one who not only accepts the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, as the highest refuge, but also propounds the tenets of the four seals, which testify to the fact that a doctrine is the Buddha's. Thus, all these Buddhist systems, Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, I introduced you to just a short while ago, Chittamatra, Madhyamaka, they all propound the four seals. And as Daniel Coatsart says, they're called seals because they stamp a tenet as Buddhist. So everyone who is Buddhist should ideally subscribe to this. I think there was a book called What Makes You Not a Buddhist? And it was essentially going through these four and saying, if you don't really hold all four of these, you're technically not a Buddhist philosophically. So first one is that all composed phenomena are impermanent. Of course, impermanence was one of the big teachings of the Buddha, right? Simply means that everything that arises from causes and conditions, which is most of what we have, everything in our physical world, most of what we deal with every day in terms of the existence that we live and what have you, everything that is created from causes and conditions changes moment by moment. It's a pretty profound concept right there. Philosophically, this is a kind of undermining the tendency that we have to think that things don't change momentarily. The Buddha said everything changes moment by moment. It doesn't stay the same for a single moment. We have this idea that things are the same, that the body we have today is the same body we had yesterday. It's in a continuity, but it is not absolutely the same body. I remember hearing that statistic many, many years ago about how every 7 years, every cell in your body has been completely regenerated. Some of them many times, but definitely everyone over the course of 7 years. Well, we don't think of our body in that way as constantly changing. So there is, again, gross impermanence and subtle impermanence. Here we're talking about that subtle impermanence, that momentary change that's always going on. The second of these main tenets is the fact that everything that is conditioned, that is in this world, that is contaminated through the force of our ignorance and delusions, is in the nature of suffering, or it's called here, all contaminated things are miserable. I'll read how he explains. He says, everything in our experience is contaminated because it is ultimately the product of our ignorance. This is what I said earlier, right? Our misconceptions, especially our root ignorance, is contaminating our experience. This is what we mean by samsara. We're in this conditioned existence that is not satisfactory. That is, intentional actions, karma, performed while misunderstanding the way things exist, are the forces that cause our own births and the formation of the cosmos, itself. All of these things are miserable in the sense that impermanence itself is a kind of suffering. And this was the very first truth the Buddha taught in the Four Noble Truths, right? The truth of dukkha, of things being unsatisfactory. And that's essentially at the core of, again, what he taught. And as I said in the motivation, he taught suffering, that everything is unsatisfactory, and how we can be free from that. So the first two of these seals are indicating some very profound truths that the Buddha said right from the beginning, that everything that is conditioned is changing all the time. We can't hold on to it for a moment. And that is even, again, a form of suffering. But then everything that is conditioned by our ignorance, that is contaminated by our ignorance, is in the nature of dukkha, is in the nature of suffering. Well, the third of these noble truths, third of these four seals, is speaking to how do we arrive at the freedom from that suffering, the third noble truth, through understanding what is taught in the fourth noble truth, that all phenomena are selfless. Now, self here refers to what non-Buddhist schools describe as our true selves. This is something we're going to talk about a bit more tonight. This is the first level of understanding selflessness, that there's this idea of there being something that is the I, the person, that is a permanent, meaning an unchanging phenomenon, a unitary, meaning indivisible, partless, and an independent entity, meaning that it is independent of causes and conditions, and independent even of the body and the mind. That's at the core of our being. No such self exists, and there are no objects that are used by such a self. This is where all of the various schools will elaborate in greater detail on these four systems that we're going to be looking at. Again, the Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, and so on. They go further in terms of how they propound selflessness. But the one that was described here, we're going to talk about it. Don't think that I'm just going to skirt over it and leave it behind. This is one of the beginning points for the Buddha. Of course, the Buddha, as Prince Siddhartha, grew up in India, where this was the main thing that was being held and taught by the Vedic traditions. And the Upanishads was teaching that there is this thing that is called the Atman. Atman being the soul, if you will, of a being that goes on to eventually experience moksha or liberation through it coming to identify that with Brahman, with the the god of the Vedic traditions, and kind of merge those two into one. So there's nothing really identical to the Atman or soul as it's defined from a Western point of view. There's nothing kind of identical to that in our religious traditions that we have in the West. And I grew up Roman Catholic, so I was taught that I had a um, uh, what is it, my mortal soul or immortal soul? Immortal soul, I guess is the right word. I had an immortal soul in my mortal body. And of course, this is the idea behind it. It's similar in that there is something that is not the body and not the mind. It is the essence of who we are. All Buddhist schools refute this. This is kind of the bottom line tenet in terms of what we mean by that third seal. When we say that all phenomena are selfless, we mean that there is no person that exists in that way. There is no Atman, no soul that is kind of eternal and immortal. And then there are no objects of use by that person because that person doesn't exist. So that's how we get to this idea of all phenomena being selfless, and that there is no person like this, and all the phenomena that exist can't be used by a person like that because no person exists in that way. This is really, again, the very basic level, and we're going to go into this in a little bit of detail tonight because some of us may be holding views that are somewhat similar. Maybe we had some exposure to various other philosophical or tenet systems, religious systems that kind of introduced us to this concept of there being something that is beyond ourselves, that is this soul. And I don't think it's identical in the Christian traditions, but it's of a similar flavor. Let's put it that way. So this is an important tenet of the Buddhist teachings as well. All Buddhists will essentially say that at least that self doesn't exist. Now, how they propound things beyond that depends upon what level of the rungs of the ladder that they're holding to. And this is, again, what we're going to be kind of introducing as we go through these 2 nights together. So this is these first 3 are really the essence of Buddhist philosophy, and the fourth one, that nirvana is peace, is introducing the idea that there is a state where you can be free of those contaminations through realizing selflessness and come to abandon the true sufferings that are a part of our nature in samsara. So it says here, nirvana is not a place or a kind of consciousness, but the absence of the afflictions of desire, hatred, and ignorance being the main root. So these characteristics, he says, are continuous with early Buddhism. The Buddha taught about the 3 marks of impermanence, selflessness, and suffering. The 4 seals are these 3 marks, with the addition of the assurance of nirvana, that we can attain that state of peace. So again, this is kind of the very beginning of what the Buddha taught. I'm not going to go through this next section through the words, but what essentially we have when we look at systems that are outside of Buddhism is that we see that either they are propounding something that they say exists, such as an Atman, and holding to that kind of a view of how things, what is the self? Well, the self is this permanent Atman who is indivisible, partless, and who is independent of the body and the mind. Or they go to perhaps a nihilistic kind of point of view. And even in Buddhism, as we start investigating these various philosophical systems, we'll see that each of them propounds some middle between two extremes. And this is actually how we come to the final view that we call the middle way, as it says to be the final middle point between these extremes of thinking things exist in really quite superficial ways or thinking things don't exist at all. This is the balance that we have to go through in our reasoning. And I'm just going to touch on that really briefly. Again, you're welcome to read the little handout. But this is the very beginning point for what the Buddha taught, is that we have to find a middle way, at least that denies some of what these non-Buddhist systems that were there in India at the time are propounding. Again, he didn't have anything against them personally. He wasn't like, oh, those Hindus and what have you, they're, silly people or something. He rather was looking at the philosophy that they taught and coming to understand it through his own wisdom, that there was nothing that is the Atman, that can be identified as the Atman. And in fact, it said that that point of view has to be learned. We aren't born into this world thinking that we have a soul. I mean, think about it. Those of you who've ever heard teachings that you have a soul, meaning this, again, something that is quite separate from your being, that goes on to another existence, perhaps to, union with God in heaven or whatever the case might be. You had to have learned that. That's not something that you carry forward innately from life to life. So this is quite a coarse view. And it's, again, not one that every one of us holds, but it's one that we do have to have some awareness of, because it's the beginning point of moving away from misconceptions about the self, misconceptions about who we really are. And as we see, we'll get into deeper ones that will help us to kind of move in the direction of the final truth, what it is that we really need to realize in order to attain our final freedom from samsara and what have you. So one thing I'm just going to touch on very briefly, this is just to remind me of where I'm going in terms of tonight, are what are called the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. I'll let you read this as well on your own. But what it said is that essentially, if you look at, as I said, the Buddha taught for 45 years. If you look at these three major divisions of what the Buddha taught, they're called the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma, but it's not to think of them as being absolutely sequential. Rather, they are three ways of looking at the corpus of the teachings and dividing them according to the main content. But the very first teachings the Buddha gave were in the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, and that was the Four Noble Truths. And that was the teachings that the first two systems that we're going to look at tonight very much follow. They follow the teachings that come out of that first turning of the wheel. And that's the Vaibhashikas and the Sautrantikas. They tend to be coarser because when the Buddha first started teaching, you may even recall the story of after the Buddha attained enlightenment, he didn't teach for 49 days because he thought that what he had learned was too profound for people to realize. But then he began to teach. He taught to the 5 ascetics that he had practiced with for a number of years in Deer Park, and they were able to attain realizations of what he taught. And so he began to teach more and more and realized that, yes, I mean, there are some whose veils of ignorance are not so great. But when he began teaching, he was not teaching the same depth of teaching that he taught in the second wheel turning. The second wheel turning is the one that was directed towards this final point of view in what we call the middle way school, which we'll talk about next Wednesday. This was a very profound view, and it's one that can easily slide into a nihilistic bent. So we have to be very careful with that one. The story goes that after the Buddha taught on that, he realized that some people weren't quite ready to go that far. So he did a third turning of the wheel of Dharma, where he taught something that was kind of in the middle between those. And that's also for a system that we're going to look at next week called the mind-only system, the Chittamatras. But the idea is that the Buddha gave in these three turnings of the wheel of Dharma different teachings for different beings. And people who come to Buddhism often don't get exposure to some of these. They only get exposure to the second wheel turning, which again are the teachings of the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom. Some of you were attending Geshe Sherab's classes on Tsongkhapa's text on In Praise of Dependent Arising. That's from that point of view, from the final point of view, which was the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the consequence middle way school. And those are some of the systems we're going to look at next Wednesday. But the idea is that the Buddha encompassed in his teachings all these points of view. And then we've got, again, this study that we can go back and kind of pick it all apart. So let me introduce you to these 4 schools. I'm going to go back to the handout. I think I went down a little too far. Right now I'm on page 3 of the handout. This was, again, the handout number 1. It says here, the idea of 4 schools of tenets was received from late Indian Buddhism. So this isn't something that Tibetans made up, but nonetheless was a structure that was very much looking back on what the Buddha taught. Late Indian Buddhism is, certainly after the Buddha had passed away. Within the 4 main schools, 3 are split into sub-schools, and 1 sub-school is split into sub-sub-schools for a total of 8 schools, So anyway, I'm not going to go into all of that detail. I do have a little handout that is also out at the drive that you can access with the chart with all those schools. I'll put it up in a moment. The very first one that we're going to look at tonight is Vaibhashika. Vaibhashika is a cover term for many small sects that can be identified in early Buddhism. They're generally held to be 18 sub-schools and let's go to the next paragraph. The term Vaibhashika means follower of the Mahavibhasha, the great exposition of particulars. So they're often called the Great Exposition School. This is an anonymous collection of teachings on the topics of what has come to be known as the Abhidharma, teachings on manifest knowledge. So they do derive from the Buddha's sutras, but they are actually a separate text that wasn't penned by the Buddha. Philosophically, Vaibhashikas are the most realist of the schools in the sense that they regard as truly real the tiny atoms out of which material things are made. Any larger constructed out of the aggregation of these atoms is just imputedly existent and is conventional as opposed to ultimate. So let me take it off screen for a moment because we're going to get into this very shortly. But Vaibhashika are probably similar to what we have in materialist views in science today, where they are very much about trying to hold on to the reality of things and investigate to try to find very basic building blocks of material things. And I'm not up to date on where they're at with all this investigation. I know they got to quarks and they're at subquarks, and maybe they've even gone beyond subquarks. But they keep investigating to try to find, I think even one term I've heard thrown around is the God particle or something, like the essence from which everything is built. Well, even in Buddhism, there was a tendency to try to look for something that they could say that is the absolute partless individual particle that you could make things out of. And that is what is ultimate for this school. That is what is final, on the basis of that being the building blocks from which everything else arises. Now, Buddhism would say in later schools and later thinking that this is an illusion, that we have something that is partless, that is a particle that everything is built from. But nonetheless, this school, they're very realist, they're very materialist. They're very much pointing to things and saying, let's find the basic building blocks from which our world is created. That's their view of reality. Now, again, what they deny in terms of this view of selflessness is similar to the Sautrantika school, the other school that's at this very basic level. But their investigation into the nature of matter as well as the nature of consciousness kind of came up with those conclusions that there are things that could actually be kind of partless within both of those, both the material and the world of consciousness. Sautrantika, the next one, the next rung of the ladder, kind of moving up towards the middle way, just means simply follower of sutra or scripture, which in itself would seem to mean nothing because all Buddhist schools are followers of scripture. However, Sautrantika's doubt that the Abhidharma literature or that the Mahayana scriptures, those are again the ones that the next 2 schools follow, are the word of the Buddha. Therefore, they rely on their unique list of authentic scriptures. So this is why they're called the Sutra school, the Sautrantika, is because they are relying upon sutra and excluding the Abhidharma literature that the Vaibhashikas, as I just mentioned, that they follow, and they're excluding the Mahayana sutras, which are relied upon heavily. The Perfection of Wisdom sutras that I mentioned a short while ago are a part of that. Some are called followers of reasoning because they rely upon works by these two great reasoning masters, Dignaga and Dharmakirti, who lived in the 5th and 7th centuries and are renowned for the development of logic and epistemology in response to Hindu schools. The systems that come out of that, our tradition of Tibetan Buddhism relies upon heavily, and they study signs and reasoning according to what Dignaga and Dharmakirti set out. Others are called followers of scripture, which really means only that they are not followers of reasoning. They rely on Vasubandhu's explanation of Abhidharma and not on the Abhidharma text itself. Okay. He kind of modifies a lot of the positions that were in the Vaibhashikas. And these are just introducing you to these schools. You don't have to worry about a lot of the technical stuff in there, but Chittamatra, now we're moving into what are called the Mahayana tenets. The first two are called the Hinayana tenets, again, the main subject for tonight. But I want to at least introduce you to these two that we'll talk about next week. Chittamatra is a term applied to those who take literally the teaching in a sutra that was part of that third wheel turning. It's often translated as the Sutra Unraveling the Thought. In some other places, that there is nothing external to consciousness. That is, that the world is mind only. Chitta, mind, matra, only. Some are called followers of reasoning because, like their Sautrantika counterparts, they rely upon the works of Dignaga and Dharmakirti. The others are, of course, called followers of scripture. And they follow the works of Asanga and Vasubandhu, again, these great masters of the Chittamatran tradition. So the most significant of their differences from the Sautrantikas is that they reject the existence of external objects. You might think, what the heck is that all about? They think external objects don't exist. Well, how do they reconcile that with our experience of external objects? We'll get to them next week. But just know that, as I said, these are kind of systems that build upon what came before them and try to take things in a different direction. And the Buddha himself, in that Sutra Unraveling the Thought, did teach the non-existence of external objects as external objects. We'll get into the meaning of that next week. But we can see again how these are taking us further and further out. I like my teaching assistant, Jampa Gendon, at the master's program when I studied over in Italy. He said that his way of looking at these tenet systems is that you kind of are wading into a deeper part of the lake with each one of them. And so you start where you're relatively comfortable, where your feet are only in the water, and then you get down to your knees in the water, and then up to your waist, and then up to your shoulders, and then you're underwater. And the one thing that you want to hold on to is the thing you eventually have to let go to, get to the final point of view. So all of these schools are kind of challenging us to go a little bit further. Of course, the big one, that we have already alluded to it a number of times is the middle way, the Madhyamaka system. So Madhyamaka just means follower of the middle way, which is true of all Buddhist schools, again, because they all find a middle way between these two kind of extremes of holding on to something that they think is real that isn't, and then negating things entirely, which is a sort of nihilistic point of view. But this connects us to this school's foremost text, Nagarjuna's Madhyamika Karika, or Treatise on the Middle Way. Nagarjuna demonstrated that nothing truly or ultimately exists. Again, that's that little thing that we're holding on to, our life preserver that we have to eventually let go in the middle of the lake, so that we come to understand that what we've been holding on to is an illusion. Things still do conventionally exist, as he says here, although they don't exist in the way that they appear, as if they, had their own independent existence, they do actually exist. Again, I'll talk about this more next week, the two branches of the Madhyamaka school, because I think it's kind of going a little too far in regard to what we need to cover tonight. But just know that the Buddha, once more, was in certain texts not going as far, even in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, as what he would eventually go in some of them. And so there were different interpretations of what was meant within these teachings. Each of these, once more, to keep us pushing the boundaries so that we get to a point where we eventually step off the edge and recognize that there is nothing that we need to hold on to. We need to kind of let it all go in some sense. And I'm not saying we fall into that nihilistic bent, because when we finally let go, we come to understand how there is this middle way, how things actually do continue to exist. They have some conventional existence, and yet they lack any real ultimate existence. These are the themes that we're going to be investigating even more deeply next week. The last thing I want to point out before we go into the Hinayana systems is that when we talk about practitioners of these systems, we can talk about three different ones. And most of you have heard these terms before. The one that you've heard, the third one of these three, the one you've all heard, I'm sure, is bodhisattvas, right? Bodhisattvas are those who follow the path that will lead eventually to complete enlightenment, to Buddhahood. And we can say that all four tenet systems propound that there are individuals who are bodhisattvas who become a Buddha. However, the first two tenet systems tend not to focus so much on the bodhisattva path. You know, the bodhisattva path was elaborated upon in the Mahayana sutras. So the first two that we use this term Hinayana, by the way, I didn't even define this term. The literal definition of this is lesser vehicle. Now, again, that seems to be a bit of a pejorative. So they tend to call it things like an individual vehicle or the foundational vehicle, the fundamental vehicle. The idea being that these are the foundational teachings the Buddha gave for those who are intent upon at least practicing their own path to liberation. They might also practice the path to Buddhahood, but at least to attain that result. Whereas in the Mahayana, the greater vehicle, or what I think Robert Thurman calls the universal vehicle rather than an individual vehicle, that's where we look at the bigger picture of becoming a Buddha for the sake of all beings. Right? It's very grandiose. It's very, enlarging upon what the Buddha taught to that degree. In the Mahayana systems, certainly the Bodhisattva path is embraced much more. And as I said, there's a much deeper explanation of the Bodhisattva path. But nonetheless, the other two of these three different types of practitioners who are mainly following a path to their own liberation, they are included in all of these systems, as well as the Bodhisattva. So let me just introduce you briefly to these other two. I'm going to put it on the screen so you can see the text for that. This is the last page of this handout that's an introduction to tenets. It says here, all three types or vehicles are found in each school, in each tenet system. The first one is called a hearer. You may have heard this term, some of you. This is one who hears the doctrine, practices it, and proclaims it to others, but who has not yet developed bodhicitta. So they will listen to Mahayana teachings and they will even propound it to others, but they don't develop this mind of bodhicitta that, again, I don't think I need to explain it to most of you because you've been around these teachings for quite some time. This is what we meditated on tonight when we started the class. The wish to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. It's the motivation of a bodhisattva. So again, it says there, such a person may become liberated in a minimum of 3 lifetimes. Solitary realizers are also practicing a path just to their own liberation. They don't have bodhicitta. They are persons who, though they, practice that, they have no teacher in their last lives. That's why they're called solitary realizers. And they also extend their practice for 100 eons. It says that they practice much longer than the 3 lifetimes of a hearer. So they do gain deeper knowledge, but they still are only attaining the state that we call an arhat, a foe destroyer, when they accomplish their own freedom. Bodhisattvas, of course, I don't need to explain them so much, but as it says there, they have the extraordinary motivation to attain enlightenment for the sake of others. They also practice for an extraordinary length of time, up to 3 periods of countless great eons. So again, we can see that all of these are found then essentially within all 4 tenet systems. But in the first 2, there's a greater emphasis on individual liberation, which again, the hearers and the solitary realizers are trying to attain that. Use that term arhat just a few minutes ago. Arhat is usually translated as a foe destroyer, meaning that they destroyed what keeps them bound in samsara and attained the state of nirvana, their own personal peace. Whereas bodhisattvas, the third vehicle, are those that want to go beyond their own individual liberation and attain the state of Buddhahood, attain that greater state. So let me put the little chart. I told you there is a chart that goes through these 18 schools. Oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. But yeah, there we go. I think it's here. You have, no, this one. You have this, what are called four charts from the tenet teachings. You'll see that on the left-hand side are the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika. Those are the Hinayana tenets. And it's got the two sub-schools of Sutra school that we talked about. And then on the right-hand side are the Chittamatra and the Madhyamaka. And as I said, I'll go into more detail about these two sub-schools that are very important to understand the differentiation between them. To kind of, again, they're getting us to the middle of the lake, to where we have to finally let go of everything and find we don't drown. We actually become liberated. We become free of all of our misconceptions at that deepest level. So just know that you do have, again, additional resources that you can look at on this through this study. So now I want to talk a little bit about the Hinayana tenets. The Hinayana tenets, again, what we find when we start looking at this is, first of all, Vaibhashika is going to propound a very unusual way of talking about the two truths. We already alluded to it a little bit in terms of their being very much realists. They're very much about looking at what is ultimate in the world being these partless particles that exist or partless moments of consciousness. They're going to kind of define that as being the more ultimate thing. And what is more conventional are things that are built of those, the things that exist on the basis of the conglomeration of all of these various particles. It's kind of a strange concept. One thing I want to mention is that as we go through each of these four systems, the importance of what we call the two truths, conventional and ultimate, grows. In the beginning systems, it's not as great of a part of their philosophy. It's alluded to because the two truths were taught to those systems, but they're not as integral to attaining liberation and what have you. When we get to the final points of view, it's much more relying upon what the two truths are to get us to be able to understand what it is that will actually help us to achieve Buddhahood or liberation. So let me introduce you to this whole idea of the two truths through a few more slides. I want to go back to my slides here. When the Buddha awoke from the dream we still dream, he saw the ultimate reality of things just as they are. And yet, motivated by concern for our welfare, he worked within the world of conventional appearances, using the conventions of language to point us in the right direction. And this, what Guy Newland's referring to, this is his introduction to his text, is already kind of jumping forward to some of the higher systems and how they work with this idea of conventional and ultimate. But nonetheless, we have to kind of get some appreciation for how we get there in terms of these different tenet systems. Buddhist philosophy attempts to clarify the philosophical and intellectual content of this core Buddhist story. It's a story which turns on a perennial human theme, the doubleness of the world. This is what is embodied in what we call the two truths. The two truths that define these two aspects of reality, the two things that divide reality, that are kind of everything that exists consists of the two truths, one or the other. There are shifting appearances and conventions, the manners and traditions of the vast and diverse world. And then there is the mystery of things, just as they are, sheer reality. And yet we cannot find this reality anywhere else but right here in the midst of shifting appearances. So this is the idea that we're going to get into even deeper next week. Guy Newland's book was called Appearance and Reality. In a sense, that's what we mean when we finally get down to the deepest way that the two truths are taught. Conventional truths are the appearance, the things that we deal with every day in our lives, that we take for granted exist in a particular way because that's just how they appear and how we work with them. We have to do this analysis. Remember, I talked about that earlier tonight with those first few slides that I showed. We are encouraged to analyze, to not take for granted that the way things appear is the way that they exist. Each of these systems is looking at things from a different point of view in terms of everything that exists. Does it have a conventional kind of nature, or does it have an ultimate nature? And by ultimate, they're going to be defining that in slightly different ways. It's kind of interesting. Again, the lower schools define it in very strange and unusual ways, but it still kind of gets us into the kind of the arena of beginning to investigate and analyze things. What makes something real? This is a big question, right? you know, and when we get into, I'm don't have that great a knowledge of things like quantum physics and quantum reality, but the idea is that this is a whole nother way that our scientific investigation is beginning to see how things exist, to come to understand the relationship between the observer and what is observed and all the various facets of that. It's really quite intriguing. It's not identical to Buddhism, but it's definitely moving us into the direction of not taking for granted that the way that things appear is how they actually exist. This is a big thing we have to start to challenge ourselves with on our Buddhist path, is to not take for granted that the way things appear is how they exist. I remember first hearing things like the fact that anything that is solid, that appears to be solid, is actually like what some 90 some percent space. There's what is the percentage? 99.99999. You know, I mean, that's pretty mind blowing right there. And Buddhism kind of goes further in its mind blowingness in some regard, but that's already pretty profound. I think this is what's interesting. And, I was happy to be teaching this for these 2 nights. Again, I don't know how much justice I'll do to all these points of view. But to get to that place where we really begin to investigate, well, how do things actually exist? What is reality? Yeah, this is a pretty huge thing. I'm going to share just another little bit of quotes. I think this may be from Guy Newland as well. May not be. I don't recall who I put in there. Yeah, he says Buddhist philosophers call this doubleness the two truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth. Each Buddhist system has its own way of explaining exactly what these two truths are and how they relate to one another. In exploring these systems, we are looking over the shoulders of Buddhist thinkers as they grapple with a basic question. What is real? What constitutes reality? And I don't want people to kind of think when you're coming in here that I'm going to cause you to like totally dissolve everything that you consider to be reality, because once more, there is the world of appearance and there is the deeper level of reality. And those coexist. This is the one thing that all four systems teach, is that you don't have things that are completely annihilating each other. You have misconceptions that are annihilated in the process of all of this, and that's the other side of it when we look at what is self and what is it that the natures that things actually have. But the conventional truth and ultimate truth are always said to be a dichotomy. Dichotomy means that if we take everything that exists, everything is going to be one or the other. You don't find anything that is a third category. There's nothing that is existing that is outside of these two. Either things have an ultimate truth to them or they have a conventional truth. Conventional is generally the world of appearances, and it's different in some of the systems. And ultimate is what we find upon deeper investigation. And when we come to this Vaibhashika school, as I said, this one's kind of the strangest one because it's looking at that idea that I've already introduced you to of kind of when we start investigating things and coming to understand how things exist in our physical world, that when you get down to what are the tiniest particles, they call these directionally partless particles, meaning that when you get to that particle, it doesn't have any directions to it. It doesn't have the north, east, south, west, doesn't have top, bottom. None of those directions exist for that particle, which is kind of, again, a strange concept if you start thinking about it, because that's how it's disproved by the higher schools as well. Even if you said that things are built out of these particles, they must still have one place where they're touching or close to another particle that's to their east and one to their west, right? So it would seem that this, it wouldn't hold water in any great amount of reasoning, but it's already moving us in the direction of some sort of investigation into the nature of reality. Let me share a little bit with you of, before I kind of explain what the two truths are, a little bit of how Vaibhashika is approaching this. This is going back to the handout. It says here, Vasubandhu gives a pot as an example of something that can be physically broken up into fragments, thereby eliminating the mind that sees a pot. What does that have to do with anything that I've talked about so far? Let's go to this chart here. For Vaibhashika, conventional truth is a phenomenon that is such that if it were broken or even mentally separated into parts, the mind apprehending that object would cease. So it's kind of like saying, because things can cease to be known by a consciousness because they break or they fall into, other divisions, that then that ceases to be something that is ultimate. It's only conventional. It's only something that is on the level of appearance. Again, now, if we had somebody who is involved in doing all this investigation in science right now of trying to find the smallest particles and going beyond quarks and subquarks and what have you, they might propound something similar, right? That everything else is kind of an illusion. Everything else is a sort of appearance. All the stuff that we have in the world that is built of the conglomeration of all these parts is not as real as the minuscule little parts themselves. Now, they also apply the same thing to consciousness. As I said, there they get into temporally partless moments of consciousness so that you can find something in terms of time that would be a unit that would have its own kind of partless nature. Which again sounds a little strange, but a consciousness, a continuity of consciousness obviously is a much grosser, and it's an appearance. It's a conglomeration of all of these individual moments that are partless. This is how they're looking at conventional truth versus what is ultimate truth. Let me put that back on the screen, that chart that I had, and go through what we mean by an ultimate truth, which is the opposite, a phenomenon that is such that if it were broken or mentally separated into parts, the mind apprehending that object would not cease. Directionally partless particles, temporally partless moments of consciousness, and uncompounded space. I won't talk about the last one, but let's just talk about the, directionally partless particles. Again, when you get down to that level of something that they say is the building blocks from which everything else arises, they would say that that is the ultimate truth. That's the final thing that you can find upon investigation. And when you find it, your mind apprehending that isn't in any way differentiated. It's not made into something else. Whereas when we have something like a pot, as I was explaining, in that passage I read, when a pot breaks, well, then the mind apprehending pot is no longer there, right? Because pot is no longer there. Whereas when you get down to these minuscule particles, you can say that you will still have the mind that is apprehending that all the way down to that level. You won't have it being divided or in any way, harmed. And now, having explained this, and again, you can read a little bit more on the pages that I have on this, because I'm not going to go through paragraph by paragraph. You might wonder, well, what does that have to do with anything? And certainly when you look back from the upper systems, it doesn't seem to have great relevance. But as I said, it's pointing us in the direction of not taking for granted that what appears to us is the final word. This is going to be brought home even more in terms of some of the other systems that we're going to investigate. Vaibhashika starts us on that journey of beginning to question appearance. How do things appear? And it is, as I said, quite interesting that modern science still is in that when we look at the micro type of investigation, there's the macro investigation, right, of universes and all of these phenomena of, out in the galaxies and what have you, and trying to understand all of that. But then there's this micro investigation, trying to get down to what is the core stuff from which everything is made. It's essentially an investigation into what is real. For Vaibhashika, those things you would find upon that deeper investigation are what's real, or what is ultimate. Everything else is conventional. Everything else is, again, a building up of all of that. That's about all I want to say about the two truths for them. What I want to talk about now as a segue to move us into Sautrantika is to talk about how both of these systems are talking about the same levels of selflessness. As I said just a short while ago, in the lower systems, the two truths are not as kind of conjoined with the selflessness that needs to be realized. Remember that third of the four seals, that all phenomena are selfless. What was mentioned there was the coarsest of these views of selflessness. As I said, it's saying that there is a lack of a permanent kind of partless, what's another word for it? Unitary, indivisible. and then independent self. So let's take a look at that one and then look at the even subtler one that is taught at the level of these first two systems. And of course, both of these carry through to the higher systems. So let me go back to the handout. This is again handout number 2, and go forward to the page 2 that talks about selflessness in the lower systems. Actually, it's the item E on page 3 is where we go into this detail. As I said, I put together this because I had handed this out to the group up in in Denver, and it was a lot more information than perhaps what we need for what we're talking about here. But at least you have it. You can take a look at it and maybe see what questions arise from it. This is the first level of selflessness. This is like baby selflessness that is taught in Buddhism. Is the lack of what we call here again a permanent, indivisible, independent person. This is the conception that there is a self that is uncaused and does not act as a cause. It's without parts and is independent of the mind and body. So that when the mind and body cease in this life, the Atman, this soul, this form of a self goes on. As he says next, this is the classic formulation of the Indian Upanishads about the Atman, the individual soul that is in truth identical to the infinite, the Brahman. It does not match exactly the concept of soul in any other religion, although in most religions there is at least one soul that survives death and therefore is independent of mind and body in life. Although all Buddhists reject this concept, even the Hinayana schools regard it as a coarse conception and think that there is a slightly more subtle level of ignorance. Therefore, overcoming this type of ignorance is not sufficient to win liberation. Prasangikas make the further qualification that this conception is not innate or natural, but is the result of tutoring. Okay, I mentioned all of these things before. I'm just kind of going over the words to give you a chance to digest them again. This is a view that you have to be taught. You have to be tutored into holding this. As I said, when you're, come out of the womb and as you grow up, you don't naturally think that you have a soul. It's not innate in you. You have to be introduced to that concept through some other philosophical or religious system that essentially gives you that idea, and then you start believing in it. So for some of us, you may need to do some investigation of whether this type of self exists, because we might be carrying that over from whatever tutoring or tenet systems we might have been introduced to. But for many of us, this is not something that we have great faith in, thinking that there's something that is completely apart from the mind and body, that is this permanent, unchanging self. One thing I might mention, I haven't put these out on the materials yet. I kind of debated, and I'm going to introduce you to them very briefly. These are a little bit more advanced meditations, but there's a meditation that I will put out there tonight after I finish the class when I get home that has to do with refuting this type of self. And it's done more by thinking about the consequences of if something existed in this way, if you had something that was unchanging that was you, if you kind of you in the final sense, if there was something that was partless that is you, if there was something that is independent of the body and mind that is you, what would be the consequences of that, and coming to understand its non-existence through seeing that the consequences are absurd. What would it mean if that was really what we were, who we are? Because this is that other investigation. Again, not just what is real, but what is the self? What is the person that we are? This sense of an identity that we carry with us throughout this life and beyond this life. And what is the real kind of the person behind the curtains? Where's the thing we find that is that real self? Is this self this type of a phenomenon, something that is, again, uncaused, unchanging, something that is unitary, indivisible, something that is completely independent of the mind and the body? Again, we kind of belied by a lot of our experiences of what we mean by a self. So this is part of what we want to investigate. And when I'm introducing you to these different points of view, you might do your own personal investigation to see if this is something that you're holding to, and then to what degree Can you refute it? Can you come to understand that it's not logical? It doesn't fall into reasoning that such a self exists. The Buddha denied this right from the very beginning, and of course, this is why he was in great debate with all of these great masters of the Vedic traditions who would come in and challenge his point of view. But he wasn't just trying to pick a bone with them. He was really trying to help people to come to understand that if you get introduced to these different concepts about what the real self is, it can be confusing then, because then it causes you to concretize another view of holding on tightly to a self that doesn't exist at all. It's really just pure imagination. So I'm introducing you to that one because that, once more, is the minimal amount for being a Buddhist. That's the third seal. When we say all phenomena are selfless, we mean that that type of person doesn't exist, and there's nothing that is used by that type of person because that type of person doesn't exist. And that's what makes you a Buddhist, is at least holding that view, that there is nothing that is completely independent of the mind and body that is the I, the self. However, as was just pointed out in that quote that I read, in order to attain liberation, even these lower schools, both Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, other than a couple of sub-schools in Vaibhashika, remember there are like 18 sub-schools, a few of them say it's enough to realize anatman, that atman doesn't exist, that level of realization. For most of them, they say you have to go beyond that coarser conception to something that actually, according to the Prasangika, the middle way school that we're going to arrive at the end of all of this next week, according to them, this is something that we do have innately. Unlike that concept that I was just talking about, that we don't have innately, this one we are born with. And this is a whole mouthful of words. It's the view of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. What does that mean? Let me read what, again, I think this was from Daniel Coatsart. Let's go back to the handout and look at that description. It's a kind of shorthand self-sufficient person. But again, it's usually elaborated upon as being both self-sufficient and substantially existent. But let's just don't worry so much about those terms as much as the meaning of it. It says here, this is the conception of a self, a person, that is not only permanent and unitary, but is the boss of the mind and body. That the self is self-sufficient means that it can appear to the mind without depending on other objects. That is, that it can appear to our minds without depending on the mind and the body. We don't need the mind and the body there to come up with this I, this self that is the controller, that is the boss. Now, let's go through what he says here, because I think it's quite interesting. This conception prevails in our ordinary talk about the self. Do we not speak of my body or my mind as though the I is the owner or master of mind and body, which are like its possessions or subjects? Let me take it off screen here. I want to talk about how His Holiness the Dalai Lama often talks about this. This idea of my body and my mind. He says, if you were to be given this hypothetical offer, somebody were to say to you, would you like to trade out your body? Get the body of a 16-year-old again. Something that's much more youthful and much easier to work with than the bodies that many of us have right now, right? We would gladly do that, right? We'd change it out as if there's a me that is kind of over here, and I'm just taking my body that I currently have away and giving me another body that's this new youthful body. And I would gladly do that, right? And the same with a mind. I might say, somebody said, well, would you rather have a mind that's much sharper in intelligence and, able to realize all these things that I'm talking about here tonight and everything? And you'd say, yes, I'll gladly take that mind. This is this idea of a me that has a status among the mind and the body and, these kind of components of ourselves, but it is not equivalent to them. It's the controller, it's the owner. Jeffrey Hopkins uses this wonderful example of a sales department. Say, if you have a sales department, they're all involved in sales, sales of whatever it is that that company sells. But you have a head salesperson, right? The head salesperson is in the sales department, and also plays some role around there, but it controls the individual salespeople, right? Says, okay, you need to work on these because these need to be sold, and blah 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 blah, and give marching orders to all the various things. This is another way we can think about this sense of an I, and we all have this innately. We all think that there's someone here that is the controller, that is the one in charge. And that's why we think about things like my mind and my body. We think, oh, my mind's a mess today. My body is killing me today. Who's the me that's being killed by my body? Who's the me that possesses the body? You know, all of these are pointing to a sense of self that we have quite naturally. This is said to be, according to all of the schools except the highest one that we're going to again get to eventually, Prasangika Madhyamaka, the consequence middle way school. According to all the other schools, this is the conception you have to abandon in order to achieve liberation. And it is a conception that even Prasangika Madhyamaka says you should abandon, but it's not the final one according to that final school. But every other school says, yes, you have to get rid of this idea that you've got some sense of a self here that is the controller. Actually, that sense of an I is really just an imputed existence. It doesn't have any real substance behind it because it's not the mind or the body. But it still is going to have some status that we can find conventionally when it comes down to it. But in terms of this denial, what we are refuting at this level, we're refuting that such a self exists in that substantial way as a separate component here. So you have kind of the mind, the body, and the I. You have all three of them there. The I is controlling the mind and the body. Well, no, this I doesn't exist that way. Now, they will still say that you can find something that is in the end the I, because none of the schools go that far until you get to Prasangika Madhyamaka. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of all of this next week. But the idea is that there is this misconception that needs to be refuted by everyone, whether you're at the final point of view or not, because this is pure fiction. We think that there's a controller here. We think there's someone in charge. Running out of time here, but let me at least introduce you to a little bit more of what is said about this, and then I'll have maybe just a minute or two to talk about the Satrantika school. I knew this was going to be challenging. I assumed that. He goes on to say, when we reminisce or plan for the future, do we not say when I was 5 or when I am 60, as though the I of the child, the adult, and the senior is exactly the same? In our hearts, we feel that there is something irreducibly me here, which is special, unique, and unlike the mind and body, not changing all the time. Don't we have the sense of it being kind of timeless? Do we not describe a search for identity as finding ourselves, as though there was a real me underneath the flux of personality? Do we not believe that we have utter free will? In the West, at least, we believe in our individual integrity, that we can do without other people and just be ourselves, a richer, better version of what we are presently. But most of Buddhist schools, again, consider this type of conception to be the crucial obstacle to liberation. Only the Prasangika school says that there's a subtler view of a self, which is going to be described below when we get to the section on the Mahayana tenets next week. I don't want to go into all the ins and outs of all of this. Just know that when it comes down to it, then all of these schools will say this sense of there being like this self that's the controller over the mind and the body, that doesn't exist. But yet we still can find something that is the real I, that is kind of the basis for that in a real way, that is findable as the I. As I said, that's what will be eventually refuted when we look at things next week. Let's talk a little bit about Satrantika. Now, what's different about Satrantika? In terms of the views of selflessness, nothing. They absolutely say that those are the same two forms of selflessness that we have to realize. The coarser one, there is no Atman, no permanent, indivisible, independent self, and there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self. They, will say that especially realizing the second one is what is necessary in order to achieve liberation. They do have a difference in how they look at the two truths, though, and this is kind of an interesting one. Again, there's a whole explanation. I'm just going to give you the briefest of explanations. But it all, once more, points to the fact that there is a dependence upon the mind that is knowing phenomena. In Vaibhashika, we saw it was about whether you're knowing things at the grosser level, where they're a conglomeration of all these partless things, or whether you're analyzing, getting down to the ultimate building blocks from which all of that arises. In the Sautrantika school, they define conventional and ultimate truth on the basis of what type of consciousness is knowing that phenomenon. There are two different main types of consciousness. We have what we call perception and conception. And most of you have heard some teachings, at least on conception, right? And how we have a conceptual mind. Conceptual minds are not knowing things directly. If I ask you right now to think about your mother of this life, the woman who raised you, perhaps gave birth to you. Some of you may have been raised by women who didn't give birth to you. But that will come to mind, right? You have an image in your head. Maybe you can even recall the sound of her voice or the smell of the perfume that she used or what have you. That is only a conceptual image of that, what we call a meaning generality. It's an indirect way of us knowing things, but it can know things validly. Whereas what we call perception, or often we qualify this as direct perception, are the ways that we are getting at things without that medium of this meaning generality, this idea of things. And that's primarily through our five senses, right? When you're hearing my voice, you are hearing the reverberation of molecules that is causing in your eardrum and what have you to resonate and create the sounds that you are hearing. There's nothing between those sounds and what's resonating in your ear. That is all a direct perception. Sautrantika essentially says that everything that is known directly is an ultimate truth. Everything that is known conceptually is a conventional truth. So again, I've got one little section in here that I added. I won't have time to go through it all tonight, but I encourage you to read it. This whole way that Sautrantika presents the two truths begins to help us move into the higher schools, because we begin to see that there is a strong dependence upon the type of mind that is knowing phenomena. And we get to the final view of the two truths in the middle way school. We're going to see that there are two definite, different minds that know one or the other, conventional truths, ultimate truths. It's not going to look identical to Sautrantika. Sautrantika is its own animal. And essentially, what Sautrantika presents is more of a bridge to get us to what the higher schools say. But it nonetheless starts to work with this idea of valid cognition, validly knowing things, and the two ways in which we know things, through some direct perception and some conventional kind of a conceptual mind, a mind that is actually kind of knowing things in a very faulty way, a mistaken way, because we are thinking about things and not knowing them directly. Now, the one question that I'm going to just entertain before we conclude tonight is, okay, well then where does selflessness fall in regard to the Sautrantika school? In almost all the other schools, they would say there's a level of, at least the higher schools, that's what we mean by ultimate truth, that you find the ultimate truth of selflessness, of the lack of these types of selves that we've already discussed tonight. And in the higher schools, an even subtler view of the self that you deny. Well, for Sautrantika, it's kind of interesting. They say that's actually a conventional truth. They don't say it's an ultimate truth. Ultimate truths have to be found by direct perception, and emptiness or selflessness cannot be found by direct perception in their point of view, because it's a concept, it's a negation. Can a negation be known directly? According to them, no. According to the higher schools, yes. So this is what we get into. And again, you can read through this. Like I said, I can't possibly cover everything that will explain to the greatest detail everything that I'm touching on tonight. But know that Sautrantika starts moving us away from the coarser view of Vaibhashika, where it's about these partless particles, and that they deny all of that and just say, no, that's a bunch of nonsense. And they start looking at the mind and the centrality of mind, and the different types of mind that are establishing what is conventional and what is ultimate. They don't have it quite right, but they are getting in that direction. Let me point out to you this one part of the handout that, again, I would encourage you to take a look at. if you have a chance over the next week. It's at the tail end of handout number 2. And I extracted this also from Guy Newland's book. That's the direct one. That's all the way at the end. This is a long handout. It's section H, which again looks like it's on page 8. This gives you kind of 5 different ways that we can say that this study of Sautrantika helps us to move in the direction of the middle way system in particular. As it says here first, it introduces the idea that the two truths are the objects of 2 distinct types of awareness. This is the one I was mentioning and emphasizing. Conceptual consciousness versus direct perception. Okay, and there's an explanation of how that does that. Secondly, the sutra system is the context in which Gelugpas introduced students to the idea that conceptuality, far from being the enemy, is an absolutely indispensable tool on the path to liberation. There's 3 more points. I'm not going to go into those, but let me just talk very briefly about that one. This is a big one. You know, when we look at conceptuality, we have to begin to understand things conceptually before we can bring that knowledge in at a much deeper level. This we're going to see, and we get together next week, and we especially get to the middle way point of view. You know, there are even in Buddhism some systems that tend to be much more about diminishing conceptuality. Conceptuality is the enemy. You know, try to empty your mind of all thoughts. You might hear that type of advice in some meditation schools and what have you. In Buddhism, and particularly the way we approach it in Tibetan Buddhism, our conceptuality is our best friend. Why? Because we listen to teachings like this. We begin to understand what selflessness is, or we even understand what impermanence is. And we can understand that conceptually and eventually gain a direct perception of that truth. Again, Satrantika would say that's not possible. But nonetheless, you know, we would hold that is the actual means by which we attain those realizations in the higher schools, is that we use our conceptuality to help us to get our minds around particular ideas that we come to know in reality through direct perception eventually. So this is the path that you know, we're looking at next week in much greater detail. So I realize it's been hard. I mean, the hour and a half just to kind of touch on these basic concepts that are in these lower schools. These are not as central. Nonetheless, they are stepping stones. They are rungs of the ladder. And we begin to, at least tonight, through what we've already examined, to understand some of these coarser views of a self that do need to be refuted, especially the second one that is innate within all of us, this idea of this controller. As I said, I've included, or I will include when I get home tonight, a meditation on that as well. Let me just put it up on the screen so you see in the little pamphlet where it was part of it was meditation 47. But it's just a single sheet where you can kind of look at, well, what are the ramifications of if that existed, if this self-sufficient, this controller self existed, you know? And so it's very short meditation, but I would encourage you to just take a look at that because these are, once more, what the Buddha was encouraging us to do. Start with the grosser, the coarser forms of a self and begin to move into that depth of the lake so that you can eventually come to understand the profundity of these final points of view. So any questions? Might have time for 1 or 2. Anyone online after that onslaught of words for an hour and a half? Or in the Gampa? Yes, Shiva's mentioning to unmute if you have a question. You don't need to necessarily. Oh, Lorna, did you unmute? Maybe?
Um,
Yeah.
I
Yes.
actually don't have a question, but just while listening to your presentation, it reminded me of a Nova science show I was watching once, and it was on the history of quantum physics.
Mm,
And to make a long story short, we get to 1989, and they've developed the technology, a high-powered microscope, to be able to look inside an atom. And so they put that on the screen. And so the narrator is talking about how, the scientists are looking inside this atom and they're expecting to see a proton, a neutron, and a nucleus.
mm.
But that's not what they see. They don't understand what they see and then they showed it on the screen, what was actually you could see through the microscope was that it was just these energies bumping into each other, but there was
Oh,
nothing that actually defined the separateness of those energies. And the narrator just said, the scientists were blown away and didn't understand what they were looking at. And I thought to myself, is this emptiness? But
yeah. I mean, I
until they
think,
saw the atom, it was amazing.
yeah,
It was really,
yeah,
and I think about that a lot, when I'm thinking about emptiness, is that
mhm,
what we saw there in the
yeah.
atom that in the end really wasn't what anybody thought they were going to see.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, Lorna. And I mean, I would say, I mean, I don't know because I don't have the either experience. I've not witnessed what the scientists witnessed and what was in the Nova show, nor have I realized emptiness. So I can't speak to either. But my guess would be that it's a similar thing in the sense that when we go kind of looking for something that we think has to be real and has to be found, and we don't find it, that's the sense that you get when you come to realizing emptiness. Is it
Right.
identical? Is it identical? I don't think so.
Knows,
I
right?
doubt. But at the same time, I think it's a wonderful exercise. It gets us into this place of when we are holding something to be so real that if that doesn't exist, what does exist kind of thing. And then we come to understand it doesn't have that existence. It's pretty profound. So
Yeah.
that's a good exercise in that to kind of see, well, yeah, what is it that was not found? And that really does get to this idea that we're going to again look at more next week when we talk about the middle way point of view. When we get to what emptiness, it's a not finding, it's a negation.
Right.
Venerable Rabin often uses the idea of like keys that you put in your drawer or whatever, and every time you come home, you put the keys in the dish or in the drawer or whatever. And when you go to it and you see the keys are not there, you look in the bowl and you see an absence of keys. Well, then your mind starts going all over the place, right? Well, where the hell did I put my keys? Where could they possibly be? Did I, da da da, all the various, but that spinning off is one thing. It's the sense of looking at the dish and not seeing what you expected to see.
Right.
And
Exactly.
that's really what we're aiming for and what we have to, prepare ourselves for in a sense. So I think that's one way of preparing, certainly, is to look at what they're finding in quantum physics and that. So, or
Yeah.
not finding in
Yeah. Yeah.
quantum
Not
physics.
finding. Yeah. It was great. Thank you.
I'll have to check out that Nova show. Do you know if this was a recent episode or?
No, this was probably 5 or 6 years ago, and I was
No,
just
okay.
actually probably 7 years ago, and I was just, learning about Buddhism and hearing about emptiness and everything. And
Mm.
then bam, there it is on my TV screen. It was like, wow, like this is amazing. So
Oh,
I
thanks for
think about
sharing
it a
that.
lot.
Oh, yeah, great. I'll have to
So I
find a
guess
little
if
bit.
you look up Nova on the history of quantum physics, that might
Okay.
get you
Yeah.
into it.
Okay. Yeah. Because nowadays you can access almost anything online, especially from these series that have been around for a while. So, anyone else, anything to share or questions? Thanks, Lorna. Okay. So again, as I said, I feel kind of because I haven't tried to condense all of this down into 2 sessions. So I admit that there's some limitations from my own side that I'm not as well versed when it gets to talking about these things in such a limited amount of time. But I provided you with a little bit of reading. Some of the reading might come off as a little strange, maybe I didn't touch on it in as great a depth as what you might require to make sense out of the reading. But just to at least sample it and see what you think. Next week, we will start with just a little bit of Q&A questions and see if people have anything from that reading. But the gist is to get us then into these deeper systems of the Mahayana tenets and to really look at what are they refuting and what is the corresponding ideas that we can take away from that to get us eventually once more to the point of view that we want to arrive at, that final point of view. So I noticed there's a question of providing the transcript or the if you go to TNL's website, TNL, the Buddhist Center, it's tnlsf.org, and it's probably where you registered for this course or came into this course tonight. There is a course materials thing. Actually, maybe for those of you who, I can do it online here so that you can get an Oh, Shayla, did you put it in the chat? Yeah. Otherwise, I mean, I can show essentially how to get to that. So if you were to go to tonight's class, which let's just go to see calendar, that's probably easier. And when you click on the event itself, this is coming up. I don't know why it's not coming up so quickly. There we go. If we go to the event, then there will be a materials link. So clicking on that, you'll go to the page for this course, and then you'll see right there is course materials in the center of the screen. When you click on that, you're going to go to my Google Drive. I will be adding to this the slides that I shared tonight, just a PDF of that, and then the 2 meditations. But that's where you can find. And what I went through tonight again, it showed you the charts briefly, but I didn't spend as much time with them. It was the first handout number 1 and handout number 2. Okay. All right. Let's do our dedication prayers then, so we can conclude tonight. Sorry for keeping you a little bit later here tonight. Let me pull those up here. That screen, okay. And let's recite this together. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then the prayer for His Holiness, as well as for all of our spiritual teachers to have good health and long lives. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso I beseech. May all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Because we went a little bit over, let's just make strong prayers in our own hearts right now for the swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, so we can be guided by him once again in this world. Lastly, let's dedicate for all the beings that we're holding in our hearts, those that we know, as well as those whose situation moves us, and share this positive energy with them so it becomes a cause to immediately remove all of their suffering and bring them the causes of true peace and happiness. And may this be so for all beings through what we've done here tonight. Thank you all for joining tonight. And again, I'll be back next Wednesday for the conclusion of this. But yeah, have some fun working with the meditations and the readings, and I'll see you then. All right, be well. Thank you, Shayla, for your help online, coordinating everything. Thank you, Venerable Dundrup here. Appreciate it.